right, guys, welcome back to the Sonic Rewind podcast. I'm Grant Holmes, and I'm here with
Daniel Ratigan,
Andy Carrillo,
and Joseph Meeks.
The title of this week's episode is Echoes of Injustice, the history behind the sounds of Atlanta traffic. So we are all Georgia Tech students. What sounds have you all been hearing in your day-to-day lives that you recognize in Atlanta?
Well, I live on the west side of campus, where it tends to be a little bit quieter. But I live right by a turn, and people love to park on that turn and block the buses. So the buses honk all the time. So I'm used to hearing the buses honk, and then the cars honk back, and then they start yelling at each other, and It's super exciting. We hear every so often somebody will set out the fire alarm, and we'll hear ambulances, fire trucks, that kind of stuff. Yeah. So it's not always super quiet.
Yeah. I also live on west side of campus. Main thing that I hear is just construction. I swear I live like right outside of a construction zone. The road in front of my dorm is always being worked on, and also that just of course causes a lot of traffic problems. So you hear honks and all that sort of stuff. A lot of the same issues as you had on West.
Yeah, I live on the east side of campus in the freshman dorms, and there's noise all the time, whether it's in the morning and construction workers working on new paths and stuff, or at night when in my dorm we live right beside I-75, so if you have you open your windows, all you hear is just traffic going on all night.
Absolutely. Yeah, I live on the east side of campus too, and funny thing about our dorm, it has central heating, so sometimes you just have to have that window open in the night, and I-75, 85 is so loud right out there. And I was thinking about this a few days ago, and I was contemplating these noises I was hearing outside the interstate system. It seems so basic, just traffic in Atlanta, but there's actually a deep-rooted history in the interstate system of Atlanta. I think the Atlanta interstate system is designed quite poorly. It's extremely complicated. According to the Texas A&M Transport Institute, Atlanta has the 7th worst commute times in the nation. With so many interstates and connections, it seems to me that it would be impossible for the Atlanta highway system to be so inefficient. Unfortunately, I think that these superhighways were not built with efficiency in mind. Some of the biggest interstates, namely I-20 and I-75-85, were constructed as dividing lines between white and black neighborhoods. I-20, which runs through Atlanta in an east to west direction, has a clear divide between its north and south sides. The downtown connector was built right through areas that were once black economic cultural centers and areas that were considered vital to the success of the victims of Jim Crow laws. Sweet Auburn is the best example of one of these once prosperous areas. In the 1960s, Sweet Auburn was a center of black culture, wealth, and prosperity. In response to this, Atlanta's leaders proposed rerouting interstates I-75 and 85 to cut right through Sweet Auburn. By the 1980s, this vision had been executed, and one of the most prosperous black communities in America was devastated. Also, because of this reroute, I-75-85 is not oriented in an efficient manner at all. The consequence of this is the Grady Curve, one of the most inefficient and dangerous sections of interstate in the United States. Wow, that's a lot. Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting because really, if you think about it, these interstates were built very quickly, a lot of them during the Eisenhower administration. And although these interstates have been considered, widely successful, obviously, and so many people used them, really, nobody had a choice where the interstates were built through. It was all about economics and finances and politics. I mean, there really was no everyday citizen had a say in that. And I think despite the fact that interstates are so widely used across the country, I think Atlanta's interstates are very different. I mean, we have the term Metro Atlanta, meaning metropolitan area, where most of the people in Atlanta drive to work. People who work in Atlanta usually don't live in Atlanta. They live in the metropolitan area. I mean, I know my dad personally commuted from Woodstock to Duluth. Duluth is much closer to Atlanta than Woodstock is, but it's still a 45-minute commute. This happens a lot, and this also tends to happen with more white populations. Because as we know, Atlanta has a very large African-American population, and the people that work there often aren't commuting via the interstates. They're commuting via public transport, which is a completely different thing entirely. So I think the fact that these interstates did have this much effect on the city, I think it's especially crazy because the people that the interstates actually affect, it affected negatively.
Yeah, they had no say at all. Yeah, I was actually doing some research on what you were talking about there about commute times, and it turns out the average Atlanta commuter spends 51 more hours per year behind the wheel commuting to work than any other city in the United States. And this is undoubtedly a effect of a just uncoordinated interstate system, which was brought about by these segregated interstates like I-20 and I-75. So we've talked about these problems. I feel like we've kind of dug into Atlanta here. We're really hating on it, but do we see any solutions? Is there any light to this? Is there any good?
I mean, I would say we could just work on expanding the MARTA transportation system, expanding it to like the surrounding metropolitan area. Maybe that could perhaps help us lower the traffic and reduce our commute time when traveling to Atlanta.
Yeah, but speaking of MARTA, there's just like so much behind it. There's so many problems that have arisen from it. They try to do multiple transportation methods, but ultimately I feel like that's just splitting it up but not building up either. Like they don't focus on one, and so neither ends up being as successful as it could be. Because of course they have the bus system and they have the train system, but the train system only has this one cross that it goes through, and so it doesn't really go to everywhere in Atlanta. And the reputation that Atlanta has sort of gained for its high crime rate and all this stuff has sort of caused other suburbs of Atlanta to just sort of back out of any sort of connection with MARTA because they're afraid of the high crime of Atlanta spreading into their area.
I think MARTA is especially unique because MARTA was created during segregation, and the routes that were planned during this creation really haven't changed much since then. Of course, they've changed a little bit, but nothing like should be expected. Back when MARTA was created, because of the segregation and the laws that were enacted at the time, it prioritized white neighborhoods and not black neighborhoods. Oftentimes, most of the budget and the finances went towards benefiting the white neighborhoods and not the historically black neighborhoods, such as Sweet Auburn. People from suburban communities often reject positive MARTA expansion and development proposals. I mean, people who live, far away in the metropolitan area, they don't necessarily use MARTA, but they still have the voter power to influence some of MARTA's decisions. According to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, about 480,000 people use the MARTA, trains and buses both, per day. This number does seem kind of high. I mean, 480,000 is a lot, but this is actually staggeringly low compared to other cities like Chicago and New York. And Atlanta, especially the metropolitan area, has a large population, so you'd expect this number to be higher. And I think it's another really interesting thing is, according to Wikipedia, quote, since the formation of MARTA, the Georgia state government has never contributed to MARTA operational funding. Currently, MARTA is the largest mass transportation system in the United States not to receive funding. And I think this might be inherent to why MARTA is so unsuccessful. I think that because MARTA benefits more of the poorer areas and oftentimes a lot of the historically African-American areas, there's less of an incentive historically and even currently to improve those systems.
Yeah, and that's something I actually see personally very often. I live about 5 minutes off the North Springs station of MARTA, so I take MARTA 2 to 3 times a week. And it's incredibly understaffed, and that makes so much sense that they're not being funded by the government because it's understaffed. A lot of times I have to take the yellow line and switch to the red line. Down a lot of times. Trains are running at half schedule, so they only come every other time they should come. And so that just makes an already inefficient system worse. So I think we're all kind of in agreement. One of the major ways we can improve these horrible interstate traffic problems would be improving MARTA and maybe seeing some government funding go to that process.
And I think a big part of that is allocating funds. My econ professor recently discussed a situation where MARTA spent millions of dollars, one of the biggest budget spends in history, to add I believe it was 2 new buses. I don't know for sure, but I believe they added 2 new buses and some route. But the route that they added ended up being completely useless. It didn't really benefit anybody, and so it's been considered an economic failure for the company. And it seems like all these dollars that are attempting to solve problems are being wasted. So I think allocating funds better would be one of the best ways to help fix that.
Yeah, just like listening more into like the population actually uses it. Because I've also looked at a few of the like major complaints that are raised against MARTA. I was shocked with how many people were like saying they need more awnings and benches because like there's just a sign for MARTA. That's it for a few of the stops. They don't put a lot of funding into like actually saying like, hey, MARTA's here, and like that sort of just shows that they don't have the budget to do anything. I also know that people have like complained before about them not having like schedule signs like they do in a lot of modern train stations, which would be very useful.
So do we think that this lack of MARTA funding is an effect of the interstate system? Do we think that maybe the government doesn't want to fund MARTA so they can keep expanding this crazy Atlanta I-75, 85, I-20 mega project? Or like, how do we see that? Because, I mean, especially like in Sandy Springs, I see all the time. They're always updating interstates and interchanges. It's insane. So do we think that this is purposeful? Like, is there a method to the madness here?
I think it's really an interesting question. I personally think that because most of these systems were created during periods of segregation, and we all unanimously agree were very poor times for racial equality, I think because they were rooted in those times, they never really had a chance to develop past those policies. I think the fact that there has been so little change of MARTA since then, and through Atlanta's interstate system since then, I think there really has been no incentive to change when there clearly is a reason to. I just don't think that people view it as necessary, especially because Atlanta has a reputation for being very commute heavy rather than public transportation and close jobs. I mean, nobody walks to their job anymore. It's always a 40-minute drive.
Yeah. Just imagine if they suddenly took out the I-75, I-85 merged road to do construction on it to like help make it flow better. Atlanta would like collapse with that.
Yeah.
And like I would also like to bring up that this has just been like a deeply rooted problem in Atlanta. Speaking from a personal story, my grandparents actually came from Decatur, which is a suburb of Atlanta, and the railroads back then used to divide poor and high-class neighborhoods. That's how my grandparents met, were because they were on opposite sides of the railroad.
That's very interesting. So we've talked about MARTA as a possible solution, maybe a possible problem. And we've also talked about how deep-rooted these interstate and commute lifestyles are in Atlanta. So maybe the solution has to come from outside Atlanta? Is it inside Atlanta? Is there a solution anywhere? Do we have anything?
I think actually speaking, because we're all Georgia Tech students, I think positive change I'm seeing is recently Georgia Tech has been developing a lot of the roads in the campus. We're seeing new bike lanes being created. Biking is becoming more and more popular. I mean, Georgia Tech is extremely bike friendly. I'm somebody who bikes everywhere. I'm always on my bike. And I'm seeing it become more and more bike friendly. And that is very positive, especially for people who live in a city like Atlanta. And I think especially some of the road changes that they've been making. Peters Parking Deck is an area, Georgia Tech campus, that has undergone significant development recently. There's roads around it that are being expanded. And they recently released a 10-year plan where they're going to change a lot of the roads in that area to make it more traffic friendly, pedestrian friendly, and all that kind of stuff. And if that stuff can be done in Georgia Tech, it can be done in Atlanta as well.
Yeah. And you talking about that just reminded me. Going back to the complaints that I've heard against MARTA, one of the main ones that I heard was have scooter or bike rentals near the stops, just so that if you have to like go somewhere that's not too terribly far, you can just not go on MARTA and go on a scooter.
And I think even the scooter prices could be made cheaper, too, because those companies make a lot of profits. I don't know the margins exactly, but those companies make a lot of money. I feel like there is an opportunity for the city to put some of their budget into making those more affordable.
Yeah, and going off here, we'll talk about infrastructure and roads and bike lanes and that sort of thing. The city of Atlanta actually received a $157 million grant from the federal government to build what's called the Stitch. It's basically this massive 14-acre green space that would completely cover the connect. So right outside of Tech Campus, all of that would be a green space, like where the 5th Street Bridge is. It would all just be green over the interstate. And personally, if that's not connecting two parts of the city together, I don't know what is. I think that would be incredible. I would love, especially, selfishly as a tech student, I would love to see something like that. And seeing this federal funding come into Atlanta and seeing kind of outside support come in to maybe help us change really gives me hope for the future of Atlanta infrastructure and interstate system.
I think it's important for us to all realize that sometimes when we look outside of our dorm windows or our office building windows and we hear the sounds of the city, the noises that sometimes we consider to be loud or even annoying, I think it's important to realize that a lot of these unpleasant noises are caused by segregation and some of the policies that were enacted during this time. I think when we listen to these sounds, I think it's important to realize that, but also I think it's important to think of ways that this can be prevented. Positive changes that can be done and that are hopefully being done now that can shed light onto these problems and eventually fix them.
Yeah, I completely agree. So thank y'all for coming in. It was a great time chatting it up about just Atlanta traffic and kind of the history. This has been Sonic Rewind, Unraveling History Through Sound. We will see you next week.